because in Leviticus 23, verses 14 to 16, this commandment is given: you're not to eat bread, dried grain or fresh grain, until the day you bring the offering for your Elohim. This is a permanent regulation through all your generations, no matter where you live. From the day after the day of rest, that is, from the day you bring the sheaf for waving, you are to count 7 full weeks. Until the day after the 7th week, you are to count 50 days, and then you are to present a new grain offering to Yudevave. Now, this is total Greek, the way it is written here, although it's actually all in Hebrew. So let's just interrogate this and find out what it means. The day after the day of rest that is alluded to here is the day after the first Sabbath after the Passover. So the day after the first Sabbath of the Passover actually then is the feast of first fruits. And that actually first fruits, Paul says that Yeshua is our first fruit. And the reason that he's the first fruit is because he's the first who arose from the dead. And that happened on the day after the first Sabbath after Passover. So this then means that it's what it alludes to is the first fruits of the barley harvest. 50 days after the exit from Egypt, Israel received the Torah on Sinai. These 50 days have always been considered days for personal growth, and in the tradition, the ethics of the fathers, the Pirkei Avot, and the Mishnah are studied during this period of time. Those are the ethics of interpersonal relationships, and this is also the time that they go from new leaven, when new leaven arises from unleavened. Because what has happened is that a little piece of the unleavened dough is broken off and it's put in a warm place. And then over the 50 days, it becomes more and more leavened so that it again allows bread to raise after the 50 days that it has been in this unleavened condition. Now, these traits are the traits that are described by Paul in his letters. So I cannot take a direct text and say, look here or look here, but look at how this displays exactly what Paul is speaking about. Now, the 7 character traits that are of importance, in the first place is loving kindness, which is chesed, then justice and discipline, which is gevura, then harmony or compassion, which is tiferet, then endurance, which is netzach, then humility, which is hod, and then bonding, which is yesod, and sovereignty, which is malchut. But don't worry about the Hebrew names for these things. So the study method that we're going to use is we're going to look at the interaction of the traits that becomes extremely important, because this interaction of the traits creates nuances of character, and it enhances the beauty of character. So one can actually say that it is a gift from heaven. All the information is scripture-based. It accurately defines what righteous action is, and it is the base from which Ruach HaKodesh works. It frees believers from sin's limitations. It frees from the letter of the law, in other words, from the law of sin and death to the spirit of the law. But it is impossible to keep if Ruach HaKodesh is not there. Elohim did miracles for Israel during the exodus from Egypt. He prepared Israel over 49 days for the baseline scriptures or the law of Moses, because the law of Moses also was given on Shavuot, that is 50 days after the exit from Egypt, as the 50 days after Yeshua was resurrected from the dead, actually the Spirit was given. So this intricately links the Spirit and the scriptures to each other, because the very reason for the Spirit being given is so that he will remind us of everything that Yeshua said. The purpose is to free Israel from Egypt and to free Israel from all her bondage, and it is a remembrance period, the counting of the Omer, the Sefirat HaOmer. It refines character and elevates people to God. The human needs adjustment of character and of humanity, and it consists of the 7 attributes. And during this week, the first week, the focus is on loving kindness or on chesed. Day 1, what one looks at is how loving kindness interacts with loving kindness. Now, 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that nothing exceeds love. It is not selfish, it is bidirectional, it runs in both ways, from and to people. And it elevates people beyond self into the spiritual realm and creates the ability to relate to other people and to become part of Him. That is part of the Spirit, part of God Himself. And it goes beyond selfish self-gain to truly loving another. It is the route to Elohim, and it allows for interaction with self, for true mutual interaction. So it takes you above yourself, so that there will be true interaction between two people where self does not roll. So it's not a couple of glib words. It's a way of life seeking mutual benefit, and it is not for own benefit ever. Everyone has private space. So if we look at the discipline of loving kindness, this actually then means that loving kindness, discipline is applied to loving kindness. And how does that affect loving kindness? Now, everyone has private space, and we acknowledge these spaces without threatening them. And we must never exceed personal boundaries, and that is how it is disciplined. Because we do not threaten people in their personal boundaries at all. Now, when love is excessive and it is limitless, then boundaries become necessary for function. A child becomes an adult without boundaries if he gets excessive, limitless love. And that is problematic in adulthood, because these people make others their slaves and they cannot love properly. When one is smothered in love, it does not create boundaries, and everyone needs these boundaries. True love considers others first and does not impose its own desires on others, but it addresses others' desires. So when we look at compassion and harmony in loving kindness, the tefiret of chesed, there's a harmony between compassion and loving kindness. Now, compassion, true compassion, will create empathy and not sympathy. Now, we need to understand why sympathy can be unhealthy and why empathy is more appropriate. Because empathy feels for others, but it excludes emotional involvement. So it can help with emotional adjustment. People get so involved emotionally with what is wrong that they cannot think straight. This type of compassion in loving kindness gives love to those who do not deserve it. It does not expect love in return. Compassion is free. It does not expect anything. It includes love to those who do not reciprocate, who do not give love back, and actually also extends to those who give you harm in return for your love. It continues in compassion despite the return reaction. So this is total emptying of self, where compassion actually affects love. Then there is endurance of loving kindness, or the netzach of chesed. Now, loving kindness endures. One must not let loving kindness ever stop. It must go on and on and on. Therefore, it cannot be whimsical. It cannot disappear when a recipient is deemed unworthy or of lesser quality than self. True love never retreats at setbacks from the recipient. A spirit-led person is never moody, and love is never dependent on believers' mood. It's not good to give and remove love. So convincing another whether it is a loved one or an enemy creates endless loving. So this means that there must be endurance in loving. Loving cannot stop. It has to continue like God's love continues. Then humility of loving kindness. Loving is always forgiving. It does not take unreconcilable stands. It rises above self and own self viewpoints. And this can only happen when people are humble. It allows others' viewpoints without withdrawing love. So it allows other people to say what they think without withdrawing the love that exists. So own correctness in humility when one gives loving kindness is irrelevant. Humility in love retains the recipient. The person who receives the love then is retained in relationship, and domination or arrogance cannot exist in true love. Mostly it is possible to make peace after a fallout if love is humble and steers away from arrogance. This is also necessary for the recipient, because if the recipient is arrogant, one cannot steer away from it. Now, the bonding of loving kindness, the yesod of chesed, love always connects to another person. It expresses a desire for togetherness, for the benefit of both or all the people involved. It seeks the other. Such a love is always productive. The product is dependent on the health of the union. A mutually constructive union is a thing of great beauty. Otherwise, the product is defective. It finds effect in delivering mutually agreeable product, uplifting the partners and others around them to a higher level, to the level of the love of God. The seventh attribute is that of nobility, and nobility affects loving kindness. This is the malchut of chesed. True love always has the ring of royalty. It extends royalty to other people, considering them to be royal. It acts royally for mutual upliftment to appreciation and usefulness. It entails personal knowledge of a unique position in the hierarchy. So it always respects a person for the position that person has. But it also disregards seniority because it is secure. It disregards own senior position because it is secure in own seniority. It also disregards the seniority of others, continuing to show love and continuing to show respect, but it handles all people as equals. All true love acknowledges position and must lead to personal comfort and a special appreciated position. True love enhances life and contributes to own and others' well-being. It brings about healthy mutual adoration. Now, if you think carefully about the things that Paul wrote about who is part of the kingdom and who is outside the kingdom, these are the things that he was writing about.